order to save, you either have to get out of your ship or use a save point. To use a save point, you have to place an object down, so here is what a quick save would often look like. And here is what the same exact function would look like in any other game. Also, this was post-launch content. You couldn't just save anywhere you wanted to in the base launch game. That gets us into a really long line of questionable design decisions with the game regarding efficiency and redundancy. But I really want to stress here that I would save often and religiously because there was no telling what was going to crash the game. Which was annoying because No Man's Sky will save when you exit your ship, but not when you get into it. So often before leaving stations, I have to do this dance of getting into the ship, out of the ship to save my progress for everything I had done on the station, and then getting back into the ship to go actually play the game. There are many things which are still in the game solely to waste time. Hold E to interact with objects, turning simple, repeatable interactions into chores. When you craft complex items, you have to craft the lower tier items, which later on turns into nightmares as you search through this business card-sized crafting menu for all the reagents. Then you find you're missing some obscure material and realize that this is the sort of game where you're expected to farm hundreds, if not thousands of resources whenever you find them. There's a reason Minecraft mod packs simplified multi-step crafting, because it's tedious and boring. Where do I start with this game? How about on foot, since that's where most of the game seems to be anyways? You made a game about the vastness of space, a game with sky in its title, and then decided that 90% of the progression will take place on the ground. And a small minority of the game would involve doing things in space. Fun thing about No Man's Sky is that it tries to do this thing with the introduction being hardcore because you're forced to survive on a hostile planet, but since there's no settings screens on the main menu, you'll be slowly dying while still tuning your graphics settings and inverting your y-axis. This is a game of health bars, because everything has them. You have a health bar and a separate life support bar. Then you have a bar for the power of your multi-tool, which is needed to break things down. And separate bars for each tool you install into the multi-tool, like the terrain manipulator, which is needed to break other things, but separate things, and your gun. And then you install hazard protection upgrades to increase your time out in these dangerous worlds that have their own separate health bars. And everything is charged by something different. Oxygen for the life support, carbon for the mining beam, silicates for the terrain tools, sodium for the hazard protection stuff, ion batteries for the extra hazard protection stuff, meaning cobalt. It's like every time a bad first-person shooter would get rid of their health bar, Hello Games would steal it from their dumpster and put it into their game somewhere. This is just the health bars attached to you. Your ship also has its own set of health bars. A bar for the pulse engine to get around the system, a bar for the engine to travel between systems, even a bar for the power to just launch off of planets. These are all separate fuel systems that for some reason are not sold commercially anywhere. Nobody had the bright idea of selling fuel in this universe, so you have to synthesize. So you have to synthesize it all yourself. And the launch thrusters, they used to actually be worse. As you may have guessed, you spend a lot of time using them, and they did not have a liberal supply of power. Oftentimes you had to carry absurd amounts of spare fuel for them, or else you'd be spending time on every planet you land on just getting more fuel to get off of the planet again. Hear that again. The game used to mechanically discourage the prospect of landing on and exploring planets by making the process of taking off of those planets tedious. They've changed that since the last time I played. Now, most ships I have a tech upgrade that recharges launch thrusters over time, so you only need to refuel them if you land and take off repeatedly in a very short amount of time. Stuff like that makes this a nightmare game to cover, since I have memories of 4, maybe even 5 different times I've played the game floating around. Also, bases. Someone took a look at this game about traveling and exploring the universe and said that what it really needed was a mode to set down some roots, which is fine, I guess. There are plenty of planets I wouldn't have minded living on. The issue is that there is no good system for living in the big ships. You can, but it was highly repetitive having to constantly climb these stairs to access the base part of the ship. It was also kind of buggy, so I just lived out of my normal spaceship. It's a shame if you want to live a Firefly or Star Trek fantasy, having a mobile base and exploring the stars. It was not a big deal to live out of my minivan because almost every system had a space station, and every space station has a teleporter that goes straight back to your planetary base. Yeah, I named mine after a request for the game to stop crashing. The thing is that base building itself has changed over time. Not only has it been added post-launch, but they've also reworked it. Now, instead of starting with these circular rooms, I have to earn them by digging up buried tech fragments littered absolutely everywhere for some reason. Until then, I'm living in a space shanty. There's also now a power system, or maybe it was always there. I don't know. I just put down 2 solar panels and literally forgot the mechanic even existed.
It ain't all about
and that's feature creep. What is the point of having an underdeveloped power system? Why not just say the base is lined with nano solar panels or something? The mechanic doesn't go anywhere. It's not like I keep expanding my base and running out of power like any Minecraft mod pack, where power considerations are the constant limiter to everything that you do. I seriously can't stress how dumb it is that all of my power woes were solved by 2 Tesla-branded solar panels, including powering my multiversal teleporter that transcends the boundaries of a universal-level reality reset. I shit you not. This thing can transcend dimensional boundaries when it isn't causing my game to crash. And the funny thing is that the first base update reworked the progression for recipes, but at some point, they reworked the space anomaly to include merchants that sell a lot of these same recipes. So there was an awkward moment where I got a quest that was supposed to reward a recipe for microprocessors that I already knew. And no, this is not a tech tree, this is a vendor. The currency is nanites. There is a short storyline involving the base, but it's tedious and goes literally nowhere, probably because it was one of the first updates to the game, but I don't really want to talk story yet. So what is it you do in this game? Basically, you go around collecting resources for 2 purposes. To refill your bars so you can continue to collect resources, and to build upgrades that allow you to collect resources more efficiently. It's mostly just progression for the sake of progression, which is not a new observation, but out of everything they have updated or changed, the core of the game, which was the most tedious part back in the day, is still largely unchanged. Doing anything other than upgrading the exosuit storage, mining, and warp engine upgrades is pretty much a waste of time. I mean, of course, it's all dependent on how you prefer to spend your time. I can guarantee there's going to be something I complain about that could be solved by a dozen hours grinding and some new upgrades. But I don't want to do that. Just like how I don't want to play survival mode, and especially not any kind of permadeath mode. I've been down those paths before, it's not fun. There's not a challenge to overcome because the game has square wave difficulty, non-existent, and then bam, you're dead. I don't feel like crafting a bunch of combat upgrades for the dozen or so times I ever actually fought anything in this game. The game crashed more often than I had combat encounters. Maybe I would be more amiable to the idea if the game was more stable, and also the beginning of the game wasn't dreadfully tedious. Like if the permadeath mode started on the first space station instead of doing the little dance on the first planet every time, but it's doing a thing with the story, so I guess. After you find your ship and repair it, you're set loose out into the world. Now, in a sense, you have freedom. However, that freedom is massively overstated. In reality, you have 2 quest lines to follow, which aren't really exclusive. Initially, it was just the Atlas path. You would find these Atlas stations and build up this series of Atlas stones, the act of which would push you through the game's progression. Occasionally, you would also run into this space anomaly, which could provide some small assistance either exploring or doing the Atlas story. Then Atlas Rises came out, which added a second storyline to the game. The thing is that it's tedious and boring. Basically, it starts with you investigating hints of another traveler named Artemis, along the way meeting additional travelers named Apollo and Noel, who aid in this endeavor. Eventually, however, you figure out that Artemis is dead. Try to link up with Apollo and fail, and find out what Noel's problem is and what he did to the Atlas. Then you make a choice regarding that Atlas. The problem is that the storyline I just described is spaced out by a lot of filler. The best part is the stage where this guy Noel has you investigate the histories of the aliens you meet out in the galaxy. The Gek, the Korvax, and the Viking. If you ask me to explain it, here's exactly how long it would take. You would ask Noel, since he already knows, and he would say, The Viking had the Sentinels under control, and then the Gek, who used to be a militaristic species, conquered the Korvax and the Viking. Then the Korvax used nanites to corrupt their young and turn them into merchants. And then the Viking decided to go back to hunting Sentinels and helping the travelers. Here is how it actually goes. You go to a Viking system and find a Viking cartographer. He gives you a task to fly somewhere out in the system and get a tablet, then come back. He then tells you about the Viking, then you have to go to a space anomaly, run all the way up to the top of this place, and have a single dialogue with Nada and Polo, the guys who run the place, who don't really contribute anything to this part of the story. Then you go to a Korvax system, find a Korvax cartographer. He gives you a task to fly somewhere out in the system and get a cube, then come back. He then tells you about the Korvax, then you have to go to the space anomaly, run all the way to the top of this place, and have a single dialogue with Nada and Polo, the guys who run the place, who don't really contribute anything to this part of the story. Then you go to a Gek system, find a Gek cartographer. He gives you 2 tasks to fly somewhere in the system to do something, then come back. He then tells you about the Gek, then you have to go to the space anomaly, run all the way up to the top of this place, and have a single dialogue with Nada and Polo, the guys who run this place, who don't really contribute anything to this part of the story. Then you find a holo terminus and call Null, who tells you that he already knew all of this and only did this for your benefit. I would like to emphasize that this game does in fact have a telephone you do use to contact people remotely, including people in alternate realities. But no, go through all the loading screens. It's not like they were big culprits of the crash demon. The game makes you go through this fucking song and dance routine with Null, Nada, and Polo to eke out the basic lore of this universe, which, like, who fucking cares? I mean, genuinely, who cares about this? There is zero reason this information had to be delivered this way, considering it has zero impact on the broader story. But the game acts like this is intensely profound information that reshapes our understanding of the setting. But they're literally NPCs. I don't mean in the game, but even in the setting, they're disposable NPCs, purpose-built to be rungs on our ladder. It's a shame, too. On the launch version of the game, you had to piece this information together by exploring these ruins. It used to be one of the main things I would do since I wanted to learn the alien languages, which is a pointless activity anyways. You'd explore the ruins, and they would tell you the story indirectly. It felt like if Hello Games had just waited a couple years, some YouTuber would have come along and done some narrative deep dive or lore series on this stuff, but instead they opted to make it more blatant when people complained. Another instance of needless padding are the holo terminuses. I established earlier that there is a phone in the starship, and the other travelers can even call you on it, so why are we bothering with the holo terminus? It's padding. Instead of ending a mission, having a phone call in my ship, and then going to the next objective, I instead have to wait for the icon to pop up, spend a minute flying there, usually to an approximate location instead of just pointing us straight to it, then landing, climbing to the top of this giant tower for some reason, and finally having the phone call. It is time wasting. Moreover, the structure of the Atlas Rising stories is paced where you will slingshot through progression. Instead of completing objectives as you travel to the galactic core or wherever you want to go, instead you will find parts of the story where you will spend hours in a single star system. I mean, the base questline literally takes place on a single planet, likely chosen by the game instead of you, since the planet you're told to build on is one of the most peaceful paradise worlds in the galaxy, and you will not find others like it. I hope you like whatever color it is. And that brings up the universe No Man's Sky has created. This is the main feature of the game, and okay, it's impressive considering the team size, but why? It's like stumbling across the world's largest horsecock sculpture at 25 meters tall. It's impressive, but you have to question the artist's priorities. No Man's Sky's universe is planedocentric, which is a word used to describe how some people conceptualize the universe as revolving around a planet. Well, everything in No Man's Sky revolves around planets, rather than something like Space Engine, which is heliocentric, or revolves around stars. The planets do not orbit or move. Rather, the stars and even universe will move around whatever system you're currently in. Every other planet or moon in the system is then tidally locked and hangs in the sky. Tidal locking causes an object to have constant location. It's something that does happen in nature, but not all the time. This is not the kind of game someone with a genuine passion in astronomy or space should play, because at best they'll be mildly disappointed, and at worst they will be constantly distracted by how bad the representation of space is. The game is firmly, foundationally rooted in science fantasy. It's like The Force Awakens, when they look up in the sky and you can see the other planets in the movie from the ground. It's how a Reddit bro who tells you to just trust the science will accept things, because you're just missing the forest for the trees, man. The focus is on the planets, so let's talk about them. You are as likely to find a dead rock or a gas giant in No Man's Sky as you are to find a planet teeming with life in our actual galaxy. And yes, I'm aware that if I wanted to explore a realistic universe, I could just turn on Space Engine. It's fun enough. I have no issue dealing with the vastness of space. The problem is that Space Engine is not a game, but No Man's Sky is. I don't care for exploration for the sake of exploration. I like to solve problems. Fuel, resources, currency, and upgrades are simple enough problems to routinely solve to make exploring in No Man's Sky fun enough where it can get old after an hour in Space Engine. The sad part is, you can actually end up in a galaxy which is slightly more realistic with its worlds, increasing the commonality of dead rocks, but you have to effectively beat the game once to see it. Even then, it's a stopgap. You'll never encounter gas giants or their moon systems, and I'll never be comfortable with how things are spaced out. The goal is to be arcadey, where players can pop into a system and scan all the planets as soon as possible. And since the planets are absolutely tiny, that means they have to be practically touching to be visible. But cucks on Reddit will defend the planets being the size of cities because if they were bigger, people would never have a reason to leave the starting planet. Right. Because nobody has ever decided to explore space in the real world where the Earth is 12.7 thousand kilometers in diameter with millions of different species of animals and dozens if not hundreds of different biomes. James Webb launched, but what next? I don't know, dude. We could try actually using the fucking thing that we spent half a decade trying to put up. Anyways, you could probably do more realistic planets with like holographic displays in the cockpit to show where they are, so you still preserve the aspect of scouting the system upon arrival without totally breaking my balls here. Either that or get rid of the monobiomes. Yes, every square inch of the planet is the same, with the exception of planets sometimes having oceans. It wouldn't be that big a deal to me if Big Bertha up there wasn't taking up 90% of the sky. Or if planets being closer together wouldn't be an issue if there was a polar ice cap. But Mars has more biomes than No Man's Sky planets. There is a trippy element to realizing an objective on the planet above me is at a different angle, but to be honest, that would be possible if it was the perspective size of the moon, because the trippy part is the objective marker, not the planet being close to me. I don't need it to be realistic where each planet in the system is a little dot, and I'm actually pretty okay with where the timing of inter-system travel is at. A minute is long enough to make traveling between planets a resource consideration without making the trip take so long that it becomes boring. So if planets are further apart, then ships would need to be made faster to keep that the same. Then you have the lack of orbital mechanics. I'm not expecting a realistic planetary simulation, because let's be honest, it would probably end in a disaster. But if a planet has a moon, then maybe the moon should, orbit the planet. Or at least rotate. I mean, the only moon-like part of moons in this game is that they're smaller than the host planet. But since the host planets are small, that means the moons are so small you can observe their curvature just by standing on a small hill. The thing is, adding orbital mechanics for moons would make systems more dynamic. The longer you stay in a system, the more it changes. And you have the biomes. Pretty much every planet in the game has life in some form, even if that life is a single weird energy creature. Again, it's that science fantasy aspect of there being crystal foxes on that salt planet in Star Wars. Star Wars doesn't generally concern itself with dead planets. Same thing with something more in the realm of science fiction like Star Trek. They were exploring, but they had sensors, so they probably passed hundreds of dead planets every day just looking for the ones with aliens to have sex with. Which gets into the exploration aspect of the game. I'm not the first person to point this out, but this universe is already pretty well explored. I know it's that Star Trek style of exploration where it only counts when Starfleet finds it, but I think the game could actually stand to benefit from having way more unoccupied systems. I had a split second of panic when I entered an unoccupied system and realized that there wouldn't be a gas station to buy fuel and snacks at. Then I remembered those don't exist in the colonized systems anyways. It would just be cool to enter a genuinely unexplored system and realize that it'll be a lot more dangerous if anything goes wrong here. That gets into the world gen, so I have to pay off the title. No Man's Sky is Space Daggerfall. It's not like a space version of Daggerfall, it is Space Daggerfall, complete with the indie team and the bugs. Daggerfall nerds are going to contest that claim at every front, because they hated when Jesus told them the truth. Development focus clearly went harder into the procedural generation than the mechanics, sure. But you can't help but note the similarities. Procedurally generated worlds based on seeds consistent between playthroughs, randomly generated missions and faction reputations. economies, and NPCs you can meet with randomized conversations, complete with learnable languages and dispositions. They were 20 years apart, but No Man's Sky made successful a formula that Bethesda had to leave behind. That's why it's so fitting to start our Starfield prep here. The only prefabricated content is the main story stuff, and in No Man's Sky, even that is procedurally targeted. It's like the nightmare child of Daggerfall and Skyrim with a space coat of paint. Sure, it's impressive that you made 18 quintillion possible planets.
But why? Why would you do that? Why would you do any of that?
Hello!
Like Daggerfall, once you start to see the patterns, the uniqueness of your experience fades. There are 18 quintillion planets to explore, but really only like 40. There are tons of combinations of animals, but there's nothing special about them. I can't imagine some taxonomist getting days worth of fun out of a system where the animals are just combinations of existing types of preset animals. They don't eat or reproduce, they just randomly run around. You occasionally will see a predator killing things. Hell, there are usually only a dozen or so animals, even on a lush planet. And if your thing is cataloging them, then good luck to you, my man. Because that was only possible for me on worlds with less than 4 creature types. If Noel is serious and did actually document every single creature in his universe, then no wonder he snapped and did what he did. I would have snapped after the second planet. Oh wow, a lush garden world with really hot rain, but this time the grass is red. Truly, wonders abound. You might be thinking, hey, that's more than Space Engine. And you'd be right, but the thing is that No Man's Sky fans really pride their game on how unique the worlds are, but they really aren't? Take the Hollow Terminus. We visited it probably a dozen times. But most of them were the exact same tower, with 2 unoccupied buildings at the base, with some damaged machinery near one, and a buried technology fragment near the other. I kid you not, I saw this exact pattern at every Hollow Terminus in the game. The game doesn't even hold up to the scrutiny of one playthrough, let alone have any kind of repeat playability. Just because this is the 4th time playing the game doesn't mean I actually ever completed the game up to this point. I only stuck with it this time because of the channel. Otherwise, I'd have gone back to potion craft. Man, this game is fun, and more importantly, functional. You have to explore this map and find efficient ways to travel it in order to craft these effects and create potions that will sell for more than you spent buying the materials to make them. Oh wait, I'm not reviewing this game. Shame. You should try it out. So let's talk about the story. A big part of Atlas Rises is about how the Travelers, a race of people that the player belongs to, are trying to meet each other, but they can't do it. Artemis tries and fails because she dies before we can find her, and I'm assuming female pronouns because that's what Artemis the god was. Apollo tries and fails because we realize that even if we're standing at the same point, our worlds aren't actually connected. This seems to me to be a reference to a pretty infamous case where 2 people managed to link up and try to find each other, to no avail. Even though there were more concrete confirmations of a lack of multiplayer in the launch version of No Man's Sky, this moment was a real nail in the coffin for Hello Games, for a lot of people. Sure, they had promised big, and there were some pretty understandable reasons for why the game turned out the way it did, between the flood and the simple pressures of being expected to ship so many copies due to their agreements, but Sean Murray and Hello Games were caught in a flat-out lie about multiplayer.
Because the chances of 2 players ever crossing paths in a universe this big is pretty much 0.
The main thing to learn from this is that, while it is true that it is improbable that 2 players would run into each other, saying that it's technically possible but statistically improbable only encourages people to try. No Man's Sky has multiplayer today, and in my travels, I don't think I ever found a system discovered by another player, so nearest I can tell, players who aren't actively looking for each other but are still connected won't ever really meet anybody. Anyways, this story seemed to have motivated Hello Games' writing, because afterwards they would increasingly ramp up the multiplayer components while telling a story about it. Apollo and our attempt to meet is exactly what happened to those players on the first day of the original game's launch. After some updates, multiplayer started as messages that could be left between players, and upgraded to events where players could see dots that represented the other people. Not full multiplayer, but signs. That's when Next came, bringing with it full-scale multiplayer. I haven't tried it because honestly it sounds like a nightmare. I mean, even if the crashes were fixed again, I can't imagine enjoying this game cooperatively. Not every game is like Morrowind and has surprisingly robust cooperative magic mechanics, despite having initially been built as a single-player game. Generally speaking, games meant for cooperative play have to be built from the ground up to mechanically support that. Imagine that bit about learning about the history of the aliens in the game. Now imagine having to do all that with 3 of your friends over Discord. If anything, you might be better off playing it cooperatively in a couch co-op style on survival mode, where you pass the controller on death. Now that's not an official review or anything since I didn't play it. It just seems weird to see a let's play of someone playing out a story about how travelers can't meet up while playing in a mode where travelers have met up and are exploring together. Double weird since they reworked the space anomaly to also have a bunch of travelers just hanging around, including one guy who is definitely a chamois reference, which I'm not sure how to interpret. The problem is that at its core, it's still just No Man's Sky. I had this problem with Cyberpunk where I was told everything was getting better with the game, but it turns out all my original observations about the game are still accurate. Except obviously with this one, I never published my original No Man's Sky video. Yes, that existed, and no, not even I can find a copy. Not even the script. I really am not expecting much from Hello Games. Honestly, most of my issues have more to do with the community surrounding them. You guys realize these people encourage their customers to buy the game on their website to make getting refunds more difficult, right? They didn't have a redemption arc. They did literally the only thing that would guarantee they could continue to have jobs in the future. Can you seriously imagine a reality where Hello Games tried to sell a new game if they had never fixed No Man's Sky? Even if the company dissolved, they'd have trouble finding work anywhere else in the industry. And don't act like it's a charity. These updates may have been free, but the game is not. At their small size, the revenue of new players attracted by the updates makes updating the game itself a profitable venture. The best thing Hello Games can do is just move on at this point, which they are. They are making a new game and keeping their cards close to their chest, which is good. I will say that at present, their strengths appear to be in visual design and a bit of programming wizardry. The result isn't very good, but technically the procedural generation stuff is very impressive. And the game has a really cool aesthetic. Let's finish out on some writing stuff, since this is a weak point for them, which isn't surprising considering they started with like Joe Danger. Alright, the core of the problem is this stupid simulation meme the game is built around. Hey everyone, wouldn't it be meta if we were in a simulation? What if there was like another layer of the simulation that we put Dead Artemis into? What if there was a layer of the simulation above this one? I've always detested the idea of simulation theory, if only because it gives people a really bad excuse to be nihilistic. It starts with the assumption that digital things aren't real, which isn't true. NFT meme here. Just because this video is being digitally projected doesn't mean it exists intangibly. There are like electrons passing bits of information that represent this video, the same way your consciousness is a product of electricity generated by neurons. That is to say, if we were being simulated, even as code, we would still physically exist in some capacity in the higher plane. We just wouldn't have the access to do anything with that existence. Of course, that's making a big assumption about the laws of reality or our simulators, but that's a whole other topic. We are still real even when simulated. Realness is not determined by willpower or cognition or anything dumb like that, only by tangibility. Even if we find out we're being simulated, it changes nothing. People are still hungry and still have bad tastes in video games. I guess there might be some cause for feelings of insignificance, but look around. Even if we exist in the top layer of reality, we are still cosmically insignificant. You are one of a species of 7 billion. Ton 618 is a black hole that has a mass of 66 billion suns, which apparently is more mass than the entire Milky Way galaxy. Even if we are created by a higher power, we are still insignificant. Nothing changes, so why be all emo about it? Anyways, the player and the travelers are placed in this simulated world in order to explore. The problem is that the game is kind of vague about stuff, so I'm going to have to make assumptions. But I believe the point of all this is to gauge their responses to the simulation so that they can try and correct the currently crashing simulation. Well, crashing meme, huh? The game is littered with the number 16, which is the number of minutes until the simulation crashes. However, since it's a computer program, that could actually be a very long time from the traveler's perspective. It is long enough for Noel to fully document all 18 quintillion planets, hence his robotic form. So each instance is interested in seeing how the travelers react to the simulation. Artemis just wants to explore worlds and make friends, which I think represents both Hello Games' perception of their audience before the launch, as well as the audience they have been trying to build with their post-launch content. However, at present, the audience didn't manifest, meaning that Artemis is guaranteed to perish in the attempt. Artemis is replaced narratively with Apollo, a traveler who viewed the world cynically. He merely focused on his own progression, and even serves as a vehicle to push players to follow the base building story. In a way, he represents half of the player base that their initial vision of No Man's Sky actually got. Then you have Null, a traveler that represents player entitlement. Null is the other half of the players, the ones who want to see everything, the ones who push against releasing the Atlas because their own personal progress may be lost. The ones who don't accept the story as is and so made the simulation, or metaphorically the game in this case, worse as a consequence of their actions. Finally, you have the player, a character in themselves since we're often told what we're feeling and how we react to things. I have the hardest time reading this guy due to the inherent conflict between my desire to have my own feelings, which are very different from his, and dealing with his reactions to the world. It's often a case of being told rather than shown, which is fine. But I don't see why I need to have my reactions also be told to me, rather than simply being told what is happening, and being allowed to have my own reactions. Being the player is part of the reason the simulation is different, why this simulation changes things. Or maybe many of them do. The base building story arc gives big implications that the player in past iterations is the person who arranged all the contracts for the current simulation. Honestly, with the treatment I just gave it, No Man's Sky story is still lacking. The Atlas wants the player to experience creating worlds, for some reason. Is it just an interface for the simulation, or does it have desires? Why is it interested in sharing the joys of creation? Why does it feel pain about the increasingly corrupted and failing simulation? The idea might be that the root of the corruption that is killing the simulation is some kind of intelligence the Atlas has formed, and that the Atlas obsession with creating worlds is the problem. I don't know. I'm generally pretty quick to pick up on meanings, but with No Man's Sky, I really just feel myself writing for Hello Games. They wanted to make a game where the story was told through exploration, where you figured out the alien cultures through studying their monuments and interacting, and where you figured out the Atlas by dealing with it. And then when that wasn't obvious enough, they made the Atlas Rises story to try and be a lot more obvious about it. I just think the core problem is that, like a co-op, you can't retrofit this thing to be better. I do think it's funny that Hello Games tried to tie bugs into the story, like the anomalous worlds you encounter are actually products of the failing simulation. That's a really neat package, being able to write off your own issues as being part of the narrative. Why are the aliens universally present with no clear boundaries or civilization? It's just part of the simulation. Why are the planets so terrible? Oh, it's part of the simulation. Why are the worlds hostile? And there's a need for survival. It's parallel to God placing mortal limitations on humans to test them for the afterlife. The Atlas isn't a god, it's just bad at communicating its intentions, which is the biggest metaphor of that the Atlas is Hello Games. A misunderstood entity that only wanted to share the joys of exploration, but was pigeonholed into a higher, if unfair, expectation of greatness. That's cool, I guess, but it isn't good. I would much rather have a more straightforward experience. The Atlas Rises story should not have been a recontextualization of the Atlas storyline. It should have been a new thing. It should have been about going out and experiencing the world, living like a pirate or a smuggler or a bounty hunter. Going out and meeting the leadership of the civilizations and engaging in wars and conflicts over resources. Basically your traditional science fiction story. A distraction inside the simulation. Then maybe a third of the way through you warp into a system and are surprised by an ominous Atlas interface. If the player investigates the Atlas, then the realization that everything you have been doing up until that point has been a simulation is greater. Did anything you do matter if it's all just digital? You could leave that question up to the player, with them maybe realizing that even if their story was just a simulation, it was still a real experience that you had. It could have been a profound metatextual story about the realness of video game narratives. Having two storylines about realizing you're living inside a computer is redundant. Having a storyline about how there isn't multiplayer is stupid if trying to develop the game into having a multiplayer experience was an internal goal. I really hate how often indie developers fall back on, wow, isn't it weird we're in a video game story? Guys, we're in a video game. Like, yeah, I know, trust me, your game isn't so immersive that I forgot about reality. If anything, it comes off as compensating. Like the devs aren't confident that they could tell an interesting real story. Or maybe there's a novelty to it. Like a bunch of programmers and artists were sitting around a table during a brainstorming meeting, realizing that nobody in the room had a passion for writing, so they settled on making the story about the game that they were creating. And that's No Man's Sky. Once I beat the story, I had a really hard time justifying playing any more of it. It's the kind of game where you play when you want to watch a long video, or a podcast, or a TV show or something.
Has come off cooldown. Shiver takes a glancing blow from one of the lasers and is knocked out for a bit. When he comes to, everyone else is dead, he himself barely alive. And then he drags his smoldering remains to the portal, armed with his infinite ammo Carnifex.
But for me, it was the kind of game that really made me want to stop playing it and get back to work. If Bethesda learns anything from No Man's Sky, it should be that when I press E, it should do something instantly. If I see one more spinning radial in a game, I swear to fuck thanks to the patrons who support my work. You know the drill by now. Patrons get in the credits, they get early access to the videos, they get special access to talk to me on Discord, and they get status updates on what I'm working on, as well as project.
Among all people of culture is a common denominator, and that's a love and appreciation for both the Alien and Predator franchises. Throughout the years, these two titans have both done their own thing, but they've also come together to create some of the most memorable experiences in both film and gaming. Speaking of which, I thought it'd be worth going back and taking a look at some of those more notable entries as far back as 1993.
Run, but you can't hide.
And although the series is most well known for its first-person shooters, it actually started off with a couple of forays into the beat-em-up genre, with titles on both the Super Nintendo and in the arcades. Right, so before we get started, I've got to mention that this video is sponsored by Nvidia and MSI. And before we get too far into things, I've got to give a quick rundown over their new beastly MSI Pulse 17 B13 VGK laptop. God, that's a mouthful. Now that sci-fi design on the outside only give me hints at the powerful innards within. I'm talking graphics power up to an Nvidia GeForce RTX 4070 with 8GB of GDDR6 RAM, and processor power up to an Intel Core i7 13700H. Which means the MSI Pulse 17 is built for a mix of everyday computing, but most importantly, plenty of gaming.
If you don't mind my
On the
saying,
GPU front, you get all the
well equipped
benefits
for a
of the latest
mercenary camp.
Nvidia technology. There's DLSS 3 with AI upscaling and frame generation for a serious
Let's see
bump
what
to
he has
frame
to say.
rates, even with ray
This is
tracing on.
disturbing news.
Plus,
When
Max-Q
undead
technology
or demonic forces
optimizes
are found,
overall
I
system
help the
performance,
Sentinels
including
destroy
battery
them.
life,
At
power,
first, I
and
was
acoustics.
unaccustomed to the manners of
Speaking of
the
battery
Night
life, the
Elves.
MSI
I have
Pulse
grown to
17
respect
laptop's
them
got a
greatly
built-in
as
mux
allies.
switch, so you can choose between better
Balthul's letter
battery
is
life for,
dire. This cult
everyday
of the
stuff,
Dark
or tap
Strand
into
is a
more
thorn
graphics
in my
power when
side
you're
that
gaming.
must be removed.
Was that not enough for you?
I
Well,
have been
pop the
dealing
lid
with
and you'll
some of
notice
the
the
Dark
RGB
Strand
backlit
scum
support for
northeast of
gamers
here
who
at Orville
love a bit of an
Aaron.
impromptu
One of their
light
number
show.
possesses
So
a
to learn
soul
more about
gem
the
that I
MSI
believe
Pulse
holds a
17,
secret.
hit that link in the video
Bring it to me.
description for more info.
I
Now, the Super Nintendo game was released in early 1993 and developed by Japanese team Joradan, whose only other notable title was a Game Boy port for Bubble Bobble. Anyway, the story in this is that in the far future, on a distant planet named Vega 4, humans have accidentally dug up a bunch of xenomorph eggs, which then eventually gestate into fully formed Xenos and take over the city of New Shanghai. As a lone predator who happens to be in the neighborhood getting up to no good, you pick up the distress signal and land on the planet, with the sole purpose of beating up as many of these things as is humanly possible. Now, in terms of the gameplay, it's pretty simple and should feel pretty familiar to people used to similar titles like Streets of Rage or Double Dragon. For every level, you move from the left to the right, along with jumping, punching, and sliding. Weapons include the Predator's wrist blade, the throwing discs, spears, plus you can also cloak and use the Predator's plasma caster, which has infinite energy. And it's far too easy to just hang back on one side of the map with this thing and spam it repeatedly, which will have that annoying high-pitched sound it makes burned into your brain.
Shut up!
Charge this up long enough and it even releases a really powerful blast that looks like a rejected spell from Golden Axe, which damages everything on the screen. It's kind of funny seeing the aliens completely ignore the Predator when he's cloaked, even though most iterations showed that aliens can see right through that thing. But you will enjoy those brief moments of respite you get where you're not having to mash the attack button, because otherwise this is one horrendous and tedious game. The reason being that you're really just beating on the same couple of alien types over and over, and I mean there's nothing wrong with repetition, I mean it's the foundation for most beat 'em ups, but if that repetition is just the same couple of button inputs, well then it starts to border into tedium. The boss fights are just horrendous too, like this one that jumps in and out of water because apparently Xenos can gestate in dolphins. This thing pops out for mere nanoseconds, taking a few swipes at you, along with turning into a fucking wagon wheel and slamming into the player at high speeds. Followed by this boss, which is apparently what happens when a Xeno has a gorilla as a host. Or how about taking out endless chest bursters that fall from the sky, because yeah, that's fun, and apparently also constitutes as a boss encounter. It's actually a bit of a masterclass in how to not design end-of-level boss fights, and all of these are about as fun as trying to pull out your toenails with rusty pliers. I will admit though that slide move is hilarious, and if I had the patience to just push two buttons over and over, well, yeah, I'd probably sit there for the 45 minutes it takes to beat this thing.
It is the resting place of the doomed city of Zora, destroyed during the Sundering and submerged beneath the seas.
One of the main reasons that this thing sucks is because it lacks the most important mechanic for a beat 'em up, and that's the co-op play. Yeah, for some reason, this is a one-player game, which I guess on some level does kind of make sense, considering you're playing as one of the galaxy's most solitary hunters. But just from a basic enjoyment perspective, it makes the whole thing just so boring playing while you're lonesome.
You seem to be full of wanderlust by the looks of you. Have you been to the
And you
Stone
can't help but
Dweller
wonder what it
Mountains?
really would have
It is
been
a
like
land
if you had a
plagued by
second
the
player to
Venture
help.
Company and
Well,
other
wonder no
enemies of the
further,
night.
because that question got answered with Capcom's
Sentinel
arcade
Wolfrunner
classic.
sent my friend Kayla Shadowspear there to investigate what's happening to the land.
Simply titled Alien
I have
vs.
yet to hear
Predator,
word
this one was
back
an
from
arcade
them.
exclusive released
I'm
in
even more
1994,
concerned because
which
the
even supported
Alliance
up to
sent a
3
gnome
players at
mage
once.
along with
Able
her.
to play as either a hunter or
A sign
warrior
of trouble
predator,
for sure.
Lieutenant Lin Kurosawa,
Would
or
you
even
find
Major
her
Dutch
and report
himself.
back
Yeah,
to me?
making this the only game I think in the entire
forest
franchise
spirits
that
tell me you
references
are
the
brave
first
and
Predator
willing to
film.
travel.
It even looks
To
a
the
little bit
south,
like
not
Arnie.
far
Well,
from
as
Mr.
much as
Lake,
they could make
there
it
lies
look
a
like
tunnel
him without
named the
getting
Talon
sued.
Deep Path.
Each character
Through
also
this
has
tunnel, you
different
will come to an area
movesets,
known
stats,
as
and abilities,
Windshear
so they
Crag
don't just all
in
feel
the
like
Stone
clones of
Talon
Bimmy and
Mountains.
Jimmy from Double Dragon.
Once there,
The
journey
story in
to
this one is
southwest
similar to
past
the
Cragpool
SNES
Lake,
version,
then
with the
north,
city being
up the
overrun by
steep slope
aliens,
until
only
you
this
reach
time the
Stone
Predators
Talon
are
Peak.
working with the humans.
There awaits
And how we
Keeper
still
Alba
haven't had an
Thorpe.
AVP
His
movie
bidding
that's
person,
brought back an
journey
aging
will be
Arnold
perilous.
Schwarzenegger to utilize this very plot
the
point is
adventurer
anyone's
from
guess.
Darkshore.
Anyway, it doesn't take too long to
Solarin has
play
done
this
well
before
to
you
send you
realize
here
just
so
how
quickly,
awesome the whole
adventurer.
thing is, and
I wish
goddamn
your
son,
trip
this
here
one has
wasn't
the
under
same level of
such
quality
dire
and polish
stress.
that's really
Perhaps
prevalent
with
with
your
most
help, we
Capcom
can
beat 'em ups
improve
from the
matters.
1990s,
I would start my
showing off the
visit
kind
by
of masterful
speaking to the
sprite
other
work that
citizens
really helped to
of Osteron.
define
Some
an
could
entire
surely use your
decade.
aid.
Not to mention just some of the best promo art of all
Adventurer,
time. I
a
mean, get
longtime
load of
friend
this
of mine,
stuff.
is also
The Punisher
aiding the
arcade
Sentinels
game is
here in
another
Ashenvale,
title that also
but he
comes
has
to
yet
mind
to
here,
return.
showing how Capcom
He
are
had
really able
leads
to
on
take an
finding
IP
an
that
island
wasn't
that
even theirs to
slowed
begin with,
rogue
but
attacks
inject it
on
with their own
people.
flair and
A
DNA
rod
and really make
created
it
by a
stand
now
out and
dead
feel
evil
unique.
wizard.
Not to mention just make the
Before
whole
he
thing
left
a
you,
lot of
he
fun to
mentioned
play
seeking
through.
out a gem for the rod. He mentioned the gem possibly being hidden at the
Similarly
shrine
with
in Lake
AVP,
Palathon
not
at the
only
base
does
of
this
the
game
mountain
just
to the
look and
west.
sound
The
amazing,
gem
but
was being
it's
held
also
there
a
before
blast
it
to
was
play,
overrun.
with a justifiably
Find my
challenging
friend,
difficulty
adventurer.
mode that can somewhat be balanced out against the
Directly to the
player's own
north of
skill level.
Astronar are
Controls
the
are really
Thistle
simple,
Fir
you've got a
Furball.
basic melee
My
attack, either
scouts
kicking or
report that
punching
their
or
numbers
using a
have
melee
grown
weapon,
greatly
along with a
over the
ranged
past
attack
few
that differs
months.
for each
If
character.
they grow too
Predators
great,
get
they
access
may
to
find
those
the
awesome
courage to
plasma
attack
casters,
Astronar
Lin gets a
directly.
semi-automatic
Kill
pistol,
as
and
many
Dutch
of their
gets a
kind as
machine
you
gun
can,
built into
but
his
bring me
arm.
their
And to
chieftain's
balance out
spell
all of
as
these having
proof that
unlimited
their
ammo,
efforts
they'll
have been
overheat if they're
stifled.
used too often. Aside from that, you can
shall
also
remain
pick up the
here in
many
Astronar and
weapons
await
scattered
word
around
from
each
you.
stage.
A loon
Series
be with
favorites like the pulse rifle, the smart gun, and the flamethrower. And look, man, if the sight of a predator wielding a smart gun and a goddamn pulse rifle doesn't get you warm between the thighs, well, then nothing will. Simple controls are the cornerstone of any good beat 'em up, but Capcom has still found a few ways here to expand upon it just being 3 inputs. So yeah, while simply mashing the attack button will end up with a basic but effective combo, even something as basic as jumping and attacking will have different effects. If you're grappling an enemy, jumping and then pressing attack will even let you pile drive an enemy into the ground like your Zangief from Street Fighter. and press both the melee attack and ranged attack at the same time, and you'll let off a really powerful special move, which again differs for each character. It's almost so fun pulling off all these moves that you start to forget how much the game is otherwise kicking your ass. Because yeah, flashy visuals and sprite work aside, this is still an arcade game at heart, and that means it won't waste time in sapping your life away faster than a gold-digging ex-girlfriend. Either way though, what Capcom managed to create here is hands down one of the best examples of the co-op coin arcade craze of the 90s. If you ever wanted to see an example of when this genre was at its absolute peak, well, damn son, look no further.
I wrote a blog post a while ago about why I f***ing hate video games, because this is what it does. It appeals to like the male fantasy.
The only crime here is that it still hasn't been ported to any other platform, something which the next game in the video also suffers from.
Introducing Alien vs. Predator for the 64-bit Atari Jaguar. You might not want to play it alone.
Now, if you're one of the 12 people in the world who actually owned a Jaguar, well then you might also be one of the 3 or 4 people who owned and played AVP, a first-person shooter released for the console in 1994. The first game of 3 to be developed by Rebellion, it was a pretty ambitious title, trying to replicate that first-person formula that had started to become so popular on PC, and attempt to get it working on a console, and it is kind of impressive in that regard, considering the limitations of the Jaguar and what they were forced to work with. All said on a US CM training base, with the player able to choose from playing as either the Marine, the Predator, or an Alien. And while the map itself is the same across each character, the weapons and the gameplay is entirely different. The Marine starts off near the stasis pods, the Predator starts off in his ship, and the Aliens start off in the hive. Now, the Marine campaign is all about firepower. You've got weapons like the shotgun, the smart gun, and if you last longer than I did, the smart gun and the flamethrower.
Bug soup.
Every second door you come across is locked, so you're constantly on the hunt for higher level security cards, which may as well be invisible, because they're often tucked inside the corpses of long since killed personnel. Predator, on the other hand, is all about honor, putting those iconic weapons to use, like the wrist blade and the plasma caster, combining his cloak and different vision modes to hunt down Marines and aliens alike. To unlock the better weapons though, you've got to earn enough honor in the first place, which has to be done by killing something when you're not cloaked. And that becomes this very tedious process of cloaking, uncloaking, killing something, and then cloaking again. And this is necessary because only the plasma caster can actually damage the alien queen. So you pretty much just need to grind out kills here, unlocking the spear and then the disc before eventually getting that plasma caster.
The only thing left to do is find the gem Tyrannus seeks.
And then the alien is probably the most bizarre one of all, because without the means to heal itself, you're instead forced into constantly cocooning Marines to essentially create what's more or less respawn points. And this might kind of sound like a neat idea, but there's so many Marines around who take damage so quickly that you'll spend more time cocooning people and waiting around for those stupid things to gestate than you will actually, exploring the level. Still though, you can see the creativity and ingenuity here for the gameplay, and for a console FPS, it does look pretty good, mostly. Even if those Predator vision modes look like what would happen if someone vomited up LSD. You also can't deny that the game has got a great atmosphere, foregoing that overbearing soundtrack and instead using ambient noise to really heighten the mood. When you're playing as a Marine and a Predator is nearby, you can even hear it making those iconic clicking noises, which, yeah, as a small kid, I'm sure is the stuff of nightmares. However, it's also come a bit of a relic by today's standards, and it doesn't even really stack up all that well against other games from the same era. The problem is that the level design is literally maze-like. That is to say, you are exploring literal mazes. When you take one look at the maps for each floor and you'll see what I mean, it's a mess. It's just like a bunch of random shapes compiled together without any kind of proper structure or flow. You gotta keep in mind that Doom came out a year prior on the PC, and by that point the entire genre had really started to evolve past this approach to level design. And it is easy to compare this thing to Doom, which a lot of people did back then, but it really does share much more in common with Wolfenstein 3D. Mostly with its singular flat levels, flat lighting, and simplistic sprite work, which was already becoming a thing of the past, even at that point, replaced with games like obviously Doom, Dark Forces, and System Shock. Those kind of games were able to replicate more realistic looking locations. I mean, in Doom's case, for instance, it was nuclear plants, toxin refineries, labs, and computer stations. That's why if someone goes off and plays Doom now, even for the first time, they're still likely to get far less lost and confused compared to if they went off and played something like Wolfenstein 3D. Because the levels in Doom and those latter games had distinct layouts and notable rooms that made it much more easy to get your bearings. These environments in AVP, though, are just the same looking wall textures copied over and over. I mean, you might get the occasional sign on the wall which tells you which part of the floor you're on, or that you're near an airlock or an elevator, but that's about it. Once you go into that ventilation system, it becomes even more confusing, and the layout for these areas just makes no sense whatsoever. This is the main way to get around the base as the alien, and also kind of essential for the Marine to get past some locked doors, and this is just a complete jumble of random twists and turns, ending in dead ends and often unintentionally having you ending up right back where you started. And I mean, what sort of lunatic designed a vent system that's going to curve around in an L shape and come to a dead end? I mean, who was the architect? Ivo Shandor? Maybe it's supposed to be a reference to the second film when Newt is trying to lead Ripley and the other characters to the vents and they kind of get lost because it's all so confusing. Nah, they just fucked up.
Which way? Straight ahead!
What I find even more annoying is how often corridors are only wide enough for one person, which makes it really easy to get trapped in and stuck because you literally can't get around enemies. And off the back of that, what's even more annoying is when you kill aliens as the Predator or the Marine, because when you kill one of these things, they leave behind an acid puddle which just never goes away, and becomes this eternal hazard that burns your feet every time you're forced to walk over it. Bullshit! I mean, I haven't seen this many burned feet since a Tony Robbins retreat. It's kind of sad that this game was the so-called killer app for the Jaguar, and playing through it now in 2023, all it really does is kill any chance you'll ever have of enjoying yourself. A big part of why this thing got so well received was that there just really wasn't anything else to compare it to, especially at the time, and especially not on a home console. But in the grand scheme of things, time has really not been kind to it either, and there's a reason why people don't talk about it as much as they do other titles like Doom, Quake, or, Duke Nukem 3D. Still though, it built the foundation for what Rebellion would work on a mere 5 years later with Alien vs Predator on the PC in 1999. And when this thing launched in 1999, you can see that in a lot of ways it's really just a massively improved version of that same game they released on the Jaguar half a decade ago. Developed exclusively from Microsoft Windows, again you're getting 3 campaigns for the price of 1 here, the Alien, Predator and Marine, and each of these again offer up a vastly different experience. As the Alien, you'll be moving around at blisteringly fast speeds, climbing up walls and attacking your prey with startling ferocity. Your claws and tail are your only weapons, but that's hardly a disadvantage, because most NPCs can be ripped apart in a matter of hits. If you aim at someone's head with the mouse, you can dish out that devastating headshot using the